This particular area that we're going to discuss today around language exposure pathways is one of my biggest passions within that space. And that is because I really think there is the biggest message I want to leave you with today is around hope and around the fact that there are potentially multiple ways to get to language proficiency to be able to be the language concordant clinicians that our population needs. So I'm excited to share with you some of the research that I've done in this space and hear from you as well at the end with any questions and thoughts and comments that you may have. So first, just my disclosures, as you heard, I own my own company and I wrote a couple of books that I receive royalties for. So what I'd really like to frame our conversation around today, first, we'll talk a bit about what is the landscape of US Spanish-speaking physicians. I am going to focus particularly on the Spanish language, but as you'll hear, there will be some things that are applicable and potentially different as well in other languages that I'll mention as we go along. Then we're going to go into what are the different pathways that are available in terms of language acquisition for physicians. We're going to do a deeper dive on heritage and second language learning. And of course, I'll explain what that terminology refers to. And then finally, really the crux of the issue here is, does it matter what way you approached learning the languages that you have learned in terms of your actual ability to use that language or those languages in patient care? So first, mi doctor o mi doctora habla español. So let's talk a little bit about that landscape of US Spanish-speaking physicians to really understand the scope of what we are discussing when we talk about language. I think there is a general sense sometimes that this is an issue that only affects a few physicians in the United States, but actually, as we know from research, that is not the case. So first and foremost, we need to look at the patient population, right? And the population language needs. So 68 million, over 68 million people, and this is ages 5 and older. So actually, if you counted children under the age of 5, the number would be larger. Report speaking a language other than English at home. I like to use this a statistic around language spoken at home because historically, a lot of the data that you may look at focuses only on something called limited English proficiency. All of you have probably heard this term, also known as LEP. And part of the problem with this term LEP is that it is a very deficit-focused framework. It's obviously there in the title, limited English proficiency. It also centers only the English language rather than focusing on what other assets a person may bring if they have skills in languages other than English. So we've actually shifted away from this, but perhaps most importantly, the problem with the terminology is that it doesn't capture the entirety of the population who may receive their best healthcare in a language other than English. So it doesn't just have to be that your English is limited to make it that if you receive healthcare in your preferred language, you will understand the information better, you will have better trust with your physician, and so forth. And so it really undercounts if we only look at the population of individuals who report that their English is limited. We are undercounting the people who could benefit from receiving healthcare access and healthcare services directly in their preferred language. So the field has actually shifted towards this preferred language concept. The problem is that we don't have data that specifically captures yet preferred language. Because researchers are shifting, we are seeing growing data on that. So if you look in PubMed for language preference or non-English language preference, you're going to see a growing number of publications actually that use that terminology. But the bottom line is that it's somewhere in between That's 68 million people who report speaking a language other than English at home, and the number that report LEP is actually probably the number that we're looking at. Spanish comprises 64% of the total number of uh, population that prefers to use a language other than English, with the next languages being the Chinese languages, which unfortunately are usually grouped together in evaluations or in data. So we see Cantonese and Mandarin, as well as a number of other Chinese languages grouped together as one. But that is the next most common language, and by comparison, comprises 6.4% of the population that prefers a non-English language. So you can see how Spanish is really the most significant language, of course, nationally. This may vary in individual communities, where you might have a community where there is a certain language that overall in the United States might be low diffusion, but in that community is the most substantial, most important language to provide healthcare for that population. So I want to, share with you a concept that I think is really foundational to what we're going to discuss today, and that is language concordance. So this term language concordance really refers to a patient and clinician being able to communicate directly in a shared language without the need for a medical interpreter. In other words, if a medical interpreter is needed, then that means that there is either maybe partial language concordance or language discordance, because this is a characteristic that involves knowing not just the patient's preferred language, but also the language abilities of the clinician. And it has to do with that a relationship between the patient and the clinician. So, of course, working with a qualified medical interpreter is a demonstrated way to improve communication and improve outcomes, but it still means that that encounter is not fully language concordant on its own, right? So that's an important foundational concept that I think we tend to sometimes confuse at the health systems level, where medical interpreting is sometimes equated with a multilingual physician doing their job directly in that language. So I want to just kind of lay that out at the beginning here. We actually have data that language concordant care, so when a patient and physician communicate directly without a medical interpreter, actually improves outcomes. It's even superior to interpreter-mediated language discordant care. So it's important to recognize that is actually the gold standard for best communication is language concordant care. So although Spanish is actually the most common language reported among physicians as well in the United States, not just patients, it is still one of the languages with the biggest deficit in language concordant care. And that is because how big our population is in the patient population who prefers to communicate in Spanish. And I'm going to show you some of that physician data now. So this paper is actually hot off the press, just came out 4 or 5 days ago in JAMA Network Open. In this analysis, we looked at 107,000 first-year resident physicians and the languages that they reported and self-assessed when they applied for residency. When we analyzed all of the languages that they reported, this figure here is showing you the languages that were reported at advanced or higher levels. The reason we're focusing on those two levels is that data has shown that these are the two levels where a physician self-assessing at those levels are most likely to pass a formal proficiency examination. So we can talk a little bit more later about self-assessment because I think that's an important kind of area to explore a little bit, and how accurate self-assessment is, and the answer is it depends. This is using a validated self-assessment scale. But basically, for physicians reporting at advanced or higher, for first year resident physicians reporting advanced or higher proficiency, you can see all of the languages here as comparing with the languages in the patient population. So for each physician per 100,000 individuals in the US population. And you can see that the four of the top languages spoken by the US population, namely Spanish, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and Chinese, are all below the reference point in terms of how represented they are among first year resident physicians in this study. Another point that is not shown on the figure, but is one of the bullet points here on the slide that I think is relevant for us to consider is that when you think about these are just the physicians who are reporting advanced or higher skills. When you look at the majority of physicians who report Spanish, to just do a deeper dive in that language in particular, the largest group of resident physicians actually report their skills being basic, which is the lowest in a 5-point scale, self-assessment scale that I mentioned. So 43%, 43.7% reported that basic level of Spanish. So that's important to keep in mind. And as I said at the very beginning, this is a talk about hope. So I love that so many physicians are reporting even basic Spanish skills. That means they do have a foundation to work on. And there is work to do to get to that level where you can be a language concordant clinician. Then the next question to me in terms of looking at this data and what it means is, well, who takes care of Spanish-speaking patients? Because is it just those physicians who have those advanced and higher skills? No, the answer is no. All of us take care of Spanish-speaking patients. And this has been shown in a recent AAMC led project where there's a national sample survey of physicians that is done approximately every other year by the Association of American Medical Colleges, or AAMC, using the American Medical Association file of physicians. So they send out a survey. It includes a lot of different questions. Some of them include language. And we found that 9 out of 10 in the most recent of these national surveys, 9 out of 10 practicing physicians reported frequently caring for Spanish-speaking patients in their practice. As you can see, this is among other languages reported as well, shown on the graph. So you can see how much more frequently individuals are reporting Spanish. Now, interestingly, and I didn't show this graphic here, but those physicians who reported themselves speaking a language other than English, Spanish being the most common, but this is across the board, regardless of what languages physicians spoke, are more likely to report caring for patients with non-English language preference. So this tells us that multilingual physicians are doing more of that work to care for non-English speaking patients. Looking at it from the patient perspective is another thing that I think is really important. This is an older study published in 2014 where the researchers evaluated the likelihood that a patient would report that a patient of a particular race, ethnicity, or language preference would report having a physician with a primary care physician who took care of them, who had a particular identity within a certain race, ethnicity. There are many interesting findings of this paper, but the ones that I want to focus on as relevant to our conversation today are that Hispanic Latino patients had a 19 times the odds of reporting having a Hispanic Latino primary care physician. and that patients with non-English language preference had 18 times the odds of having a Hispanic Latino primary care physician. So, what this tells me is that patients are choosing language concordant care when possible. And also that Hispanic Latino physicians are doing a lot of this primary care work directly with Hispanic Latino communities and with those with patients with non-English language preference. So some of the work that we have been further building off some of these findings has been to explore, well, what factors are associated with physicians having the proficiency it takes to take care of Spanish-speaking patients. And so, one of the things we looked at is the race and ethnicity of the physicians reporting a high proficiency in Spanish. And we did find that, and I'm using the abbreviation here, LHS plus, as you see, represents Latino, Hispanic, or of Spanish origin. And the plus represents, the fact that many individuals may identify, for example, as Mexicano, Puerto Riqueño, and so forth. Among LHS plus physicians, they had 11 times the odds compared with white resident physicians to report high proficiency in Spanish. And yet, this second fact is interesting to consider, which is that LHS plus physicians comprise only 6.9% of the physician workforce. So what this means is we can't necessarily rely on LHS plus physicians taking care of all Latino patients, right? And it kind of goes back to that point where in which we shared a little bit earlier, which is all of us are actually seeing Spanish-speaking patients in our practice. And the fact that the majority of physicians who report having Spanish skills, as it turns out, do not identify as LHS plus. And of course, that is in part because we have such few LHS plus identifying physicians in the workforce. So let's get to this issue of how we acquire language skills and kind of explore those questions because these really have not been previously explored very much. With the first one being how can we acquire those skills, and the second, does it matter how we acquire those skills in terms of the proficiency we then have to use with patients? So let's go into those possible pathways in the context of US physicians. As I mentioned earlier, there's two pathways that I'm going to focus on today. And one of them is heritage language or heritage language learners. One thing that I think you'll find really interesting is that in the outside the United States global context, most of the world's population actually acquires languages simultaneously in childhood, right? So that's very, very different from our context in the United States. So this basically means that children at home are exposed to more than one language as they're growing up. And so that is a very, very different way to learn a language compared to how most kids in the United States learn a language. When we're talking about heritage languages in the United States context, because the dominant language of school and overall society in the United States is English, then a heritage learner is an individual who is exposed to a language other than English at home. That was, in other words, different from the dominant language. In theory, you could have a heritage learner of any language, in any part of the world. And as I said, this is actually very, very common elsewhere in the world. Very interesting, and we're obviously going to get into the details of this, but heritage learners are a very heterogeneous group with regards to proficiency. And I think you'll get to see a little bit more why that is as we get into this. This is different from being a native speaker. Now, the term native has fallen somewhat out of favor because it doesn't necessarily capture proficiency either. It is sometimes used to capture proficiency. Sometimes it just is used to refer to where someone is born. And so it may not be as accurate to capture proficiency, but when people talk about native speakers, we're talking, for example, about consider a large number of our international medical graduates who may even complete their medical training right outside of the United States in this case. And they may come with obviously advanced slash native level proficiency in a language other than English, depending on the dominant language of their education wherever they trained. And so that is a little bit different than heritage language. Now, another pathway that we're going to focus on that is very common, and actually the most common in the United States, is known as second language acquisition. It is also people who go through this pathway are referred to as L2 learners as well, just short for second language. Although in reality, sometimes these are individuals who are learning a third, fourth, fifth language, right? So, but that term L2 learner is commonly used for a language that is acquired through formal education, usually a little later in childhood, or maybe even starting in adulthood. And so these are through formal educational exposures that you are going through a pathway of learning a language. And in a way, it's a little easier, I think, because of our US context to kind of understand this path because it's very predictable. You know, you start at the beginner level, then you go to intermediate, then you go to advanced, right? It goes through that standardized progression. Not so for our heritage learners, right? They may have extraordinary comprehension skills, for example, but feel very uncomfortable with the speaking domain of a language. And we'll get into some of that a little bit, but this is a much more kind of predictable pathway. And we're going to focus in some of the data that I'm going to share with you. We're going to focus on individuals who completed advanced formal college level education in Spanish. Because again, our examinees that I'm going to share with you some data on are in medical school or beyond. So for them to actually be testing their skills for patient care, we're looking at those advanced skills. And what we considered advanced formal education was coursework at advanced or higher levels. So if you were taking a beginner class in college, that didn't count. If you were taking a more advanced class, yes. Or if you did a minor or concentration, or if you did a major in Spanish, or if you even got a degree in a place where the dominant language of instruction, even if it wasn't a Spanish degree, let's say a Spanish language degree, but let's say you got a degree in physics or something in where it was taught in Spanish as the dominant language, that counted as well as advanced formal education. So let's kind of get into some of the nuances of how it might be different to be a physician who is coming to the language proficiency assessment space as someone who is a heritage learner as opposed to somebody who is an L2 learner. What I'm getting at here is it does hit a little different. It has to do with identity. Language has so much to do with identity when it is a language that was spoken in your childhood home. And so when you are being tested on something that is part of your identity, this results in a feeling that perhaps your identity is being put under the microscope. And I want to be very, very cognizant of that. And I think it presents an interesting dilemma, if you will, for those of us like myself who focus on language proficiency, because at least my goal in when I'm testing individuals for language proficiency is to empower multilingualism. And yet I am cognizant of the fact that for some individuals, it may feel like we are kind of questioning or putting some aspect of their identity under the microscope, and that's very important to be aware of. Additionally, there's a lot of complexity to how someone's identity may be related to their language. This is because there can be certain tensions involved. For example, I may feel guilty because I didn't develop the language skills as much as my mom or my grandma or somebody else might have expected me or hoped that I did. And so I might feel guilty that my skills aren't good enough. Or maybe my mom or my grandma or my dad or my uncle who raised me may have not wanted me to learn Spanish because they felt that I might be discriminated against. So they wanted to make sure I was really, really good at English. And then as an adult, I'm now in the situation where I'm now really at a beginner stage of my skills, and that's making me feel some kind of way. And yet I feel very tied to my community, and I feel responsible to provide excellent healthcare to my community. Um, on top of that, sometimes we, or I should say, oftentimes, those of us who come from heritage backgrounds associated with the Spanish language, whether we are heritage learners or not, may be asked to play a dual role. What I mean by dual role is in addition to being a language concordant clinician or medical student, we may also be asked to take on the role of interpreter, which we are probably not trained to do, and certainly it's not part of our job description. And so, interestingly, we are often asked to do this based on assumptions, not necessarily knowledge of our actual skills, just because, well, your last name is Ortega, or you maybe something about your appearance is indicative that you probably speak Spanish, and so forth. So these are things that from the standpoint of how we are being perceived, heritage learners often experience this, whereas L2 learners may not experience these similar tensions. And so then there is this very interesting question, which is, does proficiency testing disadvantage heritage learners? I ask myself this question because I have anecdotally heard from people who are either heritage learners or even native speakers of a language who have taken some exam and then said, I can't believe I didn't pass this exam. So it leads me to the questions like, well, why might that be? So, for example, if an exam is focusing on grammar, for grammar's sake, a heritage learner who has never or who has had a limited formal advanced education in the language may make certain mistakes that maybe somebody who went through that more, predictable proficiency level pathway may not make. Additionally, you may or may not be familiar with the fact that with Spanish, even though Spanish is broadly the same language, and I often get a lot of questions about, well, what kind of Spanish do you speak? Is it the Mexican Spanish? Is it, Spanish from Spain and so forth? Actually, the 96%, and this is just vocabulary alone, is completely shared among all varieties of Spanish. So I have never had any problem communicating with any Spanish speaker of any variety. And it's just about that negotiation of meaning. The same happens in English. If somebody might have an accent that's a little bit different, or maybe there's like a word or something that they use that's a little bit different, well, it's a matter of, communicating and asking a question if there is something you don't understand. But besides that, all varieties of Spanish are absolutely equal and should be celebrated, and all pronunciations of Spanish are wonderful. Yet there are certainly some biases that are around what is the correct type of Spanish. And that is the kind of thing that I think if a proficiency exam is not carefully considered and bias is not addressed from the standpoint of the rating process, you can certainly run into problems where especially some heritage speakers, in my experience, might be disadvantaged by that testing. So for all of those reasons, and the fact that there really hasn't been a gold standard proficiency assessment for language concordant care, we developed one. I want to pause and say, there has been for years exams available for medical interpreting. And again, here's a point where that foundational concept that I shared with you earlier, the fact that language concordant care is different from medical interpreting is really critical. So an exam for medical interpreting is not testing the same skills that you need when you're providing direct language concordant care and vice versa. So require different training, require different testing. Because there was no such test available, I was fortunate to receive an NBME STEMLR grant to develop and then validate this rating rubric. We used an existing previous oral observation matrix called the SOLUM, so student instead of physician, that had been used for years to evaluate children in the classroom using their English skills. This was originally used for students who were learning English as a second language in the classroom, and they were being observed in terms of their oral language use. So we heavily adapted that matrix and went through actually 23 iterations of this matrix before we were ready to determine, yes, this can be reliably implemented by trained raters. The POLUM instrument itself can be accessed in that QR code at the top, which is part of our publication in Academic Medicine. And one of my favorite things about it is that it is out there in the public domain and everybody can see it, because I think it's really critical for people who want to potentially have their skills certified for language concordant care to know exactly what those goals are for them to achieve. And then the second thing is that although so far we've only tested and validated it for Spanish, the POLUM itself is agnostic of language. So I am excited and hopeful that we will be able to use this for other languages as well. And then the bottom QR code shows you goes to the validity evidence paper, where we compared how students and examinees performed on this tool compared to other measures of clinical language proficiency, which evaluates on these 6 key domains. And if you have questions later, I'm happy to go into more detail about the tool itself. But let's go to our final and most, I think, to the point question that we really wanted to address together today, which is, does it matter how you acquired a language as to whether or not you will pass a formal proficiency test for language concordant care? And in this case, we're going to be using as our test for proficiency the POLUM rating instrument that I just mentioned. So one thing that we need to figure out is, how do we even know whether somebody who's taking the exam is a heritage learner or not? And there is data about heritage learners in the language, applied linguistics, and language fields. But there has never been anything like that done in the physician world, or the pathway to becoming a physician. So I worked with a colleague who is a linguist and an expert in heritage language acquisition to develop these questions to determine whether our examinees were heritage learners or not. And traditionally, people are considered either you're a heritage learner or you're not. But what we found is that as we were examining the results of our data here, We're finding that there is a difference between having low to moderate exposure to a language in childhood as opposed to items 5, 6, and 7 here, which is high heritage exposure. So if Spanish was spoken about half the time or more by one or all parents or guardians in your household, then that's considered high heritage exposure. I'll show you in a moment some of those results around what was significant about that in terms of proficiency. So I'm going to orient you first. This is our main results that I want to share with you. Let me orient you to what you're looking at here. So this is a bubble plot where on the y-axis you have the POEM score. So the POEM instrument is rated, the lowest score you can possibly get is a 6, and the highest score you can possibly get is a 30. The threshold for readiness to use a language with patience, which we call readiness rather than pass, but we can call it pass threshold for simplicity, is 23. So that's where you see that kind of gray horizontal line there through the 23. You also see there are 3 columns on this figure. So the columns are separating the group of examinees into those who had no heritage exposure, those who had moderate amount of heritage exposure, and those who had high heritage exposure, which, as we just discussed, means that at least half the time in their childhood home, they were exposed to Spanish. Each bubble, the smallest size bubbles represents 1 examinee, and as the bubbles get bigger, there are more examinees with a score in with the number that's inside that bubble. What I want to kind of point out about these findings are I should also have mentioned that the gray bubbles means that the individual had formal advanced education in Spanish. Okay, so if they are white, that means that they did not have any advanced formal education in Spanish. And one thing that I think is worth noting is that formal education in Spanish can be obtained by anyone, regardless of whether they had heritage language exposure or not. But as it turns out in the sample, we didn't have any high heritage exposure learners who also did formal advanced education in Spanish, interestingly. So these shouldn't be mutually exclusive, but they happen to be in our sample of examinees. So the thing that you should kind of take out from here is that even for those on the column on the right with high heritage exposure, not all of them passed that proficiency threshold. The same is the case. You can see there are some gray bubbles that are under that proficiency threshold pass line. So also formal education was not necessarily it was not 100% of the time did those individuals pass the readiness threshold. However, another important point is that if you have neither heritage exposure, high heritage exposure, nor advanced education in Spanish, if you were in this, at least in this cohort, you didn't pass. Okay, so one or the other was necessary for passing. So let's sum up those key findings from this initial exploratory study, which we are now doing on a bigger scale, by the way, so that we can get additional data. Everyone who passed the POEM readiness thresholds either had high heritage exposure or advanced formal education, which means the sensitivity of that as a marker was 100%. 76% of those who did not have either heritage exposure nor advanced formal education did not pass. And so that means the specificity was 76%. And then finally, heritage doesn't equal proficiency. We already know this, but I think it's important that this demonstrates that this study actually demonstrates that having that heritage learner background doesn't guarantee passing the POEM readiness threshold. So what's next for this field? Well, one is more data. As I said, I'd love to study the interrelationship between heritage learners who actually obtain advanced formal education in a language. Right now, we kind of did a really kind of high level, the definition of advanced formal education is pretty broad. It'd be very interesting to explore how does immersion, a broad experience, impact proficiency, for example, as opposed to a longitudinal intervention in medical school and so forth. Additionally, I think we need to develop strategies that can really enhance the language pathway for aspiring physicians. Heritage learners come at this from a very different angle, and although they represent the minority of Spanish speakers in terms of our physician workforce, they are doing more of the workload proportionally in terms of taking care of Spanish speaking patients, and it has everything to do with their professional identity as well. And so we need more qualitative work, I think, on what is the role of language proficiency on physician well-being and professional identity. And then also explore how this relates to other health professions, not just physicians, and other languages, not just Spanish. So just to close up here, before we go to our questions and comments from you, the take-home points that I'd love for you to take with you are: one, nearly all U.S. physicians see Spanish-speaking patients, and actually close to half of U.S. physicians report speaking some Spanish. But the smallest group of that speaks it at an advanced or higher level, which would make them likely to pass a proficiency test. For U.S. medical graduates, we're either acquiring our language skills through heritage exposures or through formal educational opportunities, and both are strongly associated with passing the readiness threshold. But it doesn't mean that every intervention is great for both groups and something that we need to study further. So with that, I just want to share a QR code where you can get more information about the certification exam, and also you're all welcome to reach out to me afterwards as well. And I will stop sharing so we can see each other and